Molt bé, moltes gràcies. Anem a reprendre la sessió. Com us apuntava al principi, ara tenim amb nosaltres l'oportunitat de compartir uns minuts amb el Team Crabtree. Ell és un professor de la Schumacher College, que, com us dèiem, és una institució molt implicada amb el que seria aquest New Economics, en el qual es treballa amb la lògica de sostenibilitat i és especialista en àmbits tant vinculats a la mobilitat, a l'alimentació vinculat a la proximitat, al housing. Li donem la paraula. Tim?
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. Called my talk. It's one of these microphones where you have to be the right distance away. I've called my talk, How Can We Link Transformative Learning with Transforming the Economy? So just a bit of, I'll sort of explain during my talk my background in economics, but I suppose the starting point is that I don't see economics as a value-free, positive science. I think we have an economic crisis. I'll talk about the economic crisis during this talk. And so when we train to become an economist, we can't pretend that we're going to be this objective, value-free, positive economist. It's impossible. Whatever recommendations we make, they will be based on some value judgments, some ideology, and we have to become aware of that. So that's why I called this talk Linking Transformative Learning with Transforming the Economy. I don't know whether this will work, but maybe it will. So I wanted to, later on in the talk, I'm going to be talking about complexity theory and the way that complexity theory undermines many of the assumptions behind neoclassical economics. And if it works, I just wanted to try and show you. There should be here. So I just wanted to show you two very short videos, and I wanted you to kind of just watch and then compare the two, and then later on we'll come back to these two videos if these work. So. So just to explain, these are birds in England. They're starlings, and they flock together. And you'll see that they kind of align their movements with each other, and they create a complex pattern. And in complexity terms, we talk about emergence. So these complex patterns emerge from these birds following each other. And there's something very kind of hypnotic, I think, about watching these patterns. And later on, I want to talk about how this relates to economics. Okay, that's enough. Though actually, if I can't switch the machine on, then we could be watching for a long time. Okay. So, when you watch those birds, and near where I live, there is this enormous flock of starlings, and you can go down to the sea and see these amazing birds flocking. And about, I suppose, 20, 30 years ago, people started to use computers to understand that movement. And there's a very simple computer program called NetLogo, and you can set this computer program up to do something very similar. so I'm going to just play this computer program. So in this computer program, they take the individual agents, the starlings, and they give those individual agents a couple of rules to follow. So one is keep a certain distance from your neighbor, and then the other one is to follow your neighbor when your neighbor starts to change direction. And from those two very simple rules, this computer program can model the flocking of the starlings. It's very interesting. And one of the things that I ask my students to do is just to compare what they see in the video or in real life of the starlings and what they see in this model or this representation. What is the difference that you sense between these two ways of looking? And we'll come back to this because I think this is a really important point. So you can probably ignore the rest of the talk and you can just like have this as a kind of Zen koan, because it took me about, I thought about these two things for about 3 years and just trying to understand. So. Okay, so I work part-time at a college called Schumacher College. So the college was set up in 1991, and we run a range of courses, but within that we run a number of master's programs, and we run those with 2 universities who support and validate the programs. And the program that I work for is called Economics for Transition. And I'll say more about that program as I go along. So Schumacher College is part of a bigger organisation, the Dartington Hall Trust in Devon. It's you could describe it as a multifunction social enterprise. It employs about 250 people in many different areas: arts, social justice, social enterprise. And we're located, you see the black dot, we're located next to Totnes, and some of you will have heard of the Transition Town movement. So Totnes is where the Transition Towns started, so there's a strong link between Schumacher College and Transition Towns. And we're located then quite close to 3 bigger centres of population. So although Schumacher College, it feels quite rural, we link as much as possible with these other 3 urban areas. So it's kind of difficult to sum up the kind of the philosophy of the college, but there is an author called Gregory Bateson, and some of you may have heard of. And he said that there is this epistemological error, this way that we seek to know the world. And in the West, it's based, the dominant paradigm is based on this notion that we are separate from those things that we want to know about. So, and he calls this an epistemological error, and I want to explore this more and the way that we explore this in the course. But Bateson said that this separation makes us operate in a way that he calls it denies, fragments, undermines the interconnection between us and the wider community around us and the environment. So we have this separation. And I think we see this very strongly in mainstream economics, and again I want to explore this more in the talk. So just some of the influences in the early days of the college. This is Arnie Neese, who developed within the field of philosophy something called deep ecology. Wendell Berry, an American poet and farmer who talks about a new agrarianism. Vandana Shiva, an activist in India, taught many times at the college, done a lot of work around trying to save seeds from being patented by multinationals like Monsanto. And then the first course at the college was James Lovelock, who developed the Gaia theory, which underpins the scientific theories behind the IPCC, the Climate Change Convention. So drawing on Gregory Bateson, we would say that connection and relationship are at the heart of the college. So from an ecological point of view, we're situated in a beautiful environment. And for example, we run a practical residency for 6 months in horticulture. And many of the people who come on this course, they might be civil servants or academics or lawyers or architects, and they just want to get away for 6 months and just to have this connection with nature. So we teach them horticulture. But actually, everybody at the college works in the gardens. So every day we have work periods, and everybody does cooking, does cleaning, does gardening. So that's the kind of social connection. And somebody this morning, I think the person at the back, was saying that economics, the root of economics, the word economics, eco is home. And so everybody at the college is encouraged to see the college as their home and take care of that home. And then that learning is then translated into the work that they do when they leave the college. This notion that, yeah, the place you live, the planet you live on, this is our home and you have to take care of it. And we have to cultivate this ability to take care. It doesn't sound like very economic language, but I think that's because economics has lost its way and it's lost its understanding of what economics means. This is one of the founders of the college, Satish Kumar. He's in his 80s, but he comes once or twice a month to the college. He teaches, but he also, as soon as he arrives, he goes into the kitchen and he works with students and volunteers to make the supper. So he always makes the same curry. It's very delicious. It's like a tradition at the college. Yeah, and then, again, I'll come on to this later, but within economics, there is this idea of isolated, rational individuals making rational choices that are based on our own individual preferences. And we challenge this. We say that actually the self is not this isolated, thing within us, but it's a relational construct. And so it's very important that rather than encouraging a kind of individualistic way of working and learning, that the learning that we do is very much orientated in groups. So this is an example. I was doing a week where we were looking at housing. So in the afternoons, we would look at lots of more theoretical and empirical stuff around housing. But in the mornings, for 5 days, I got the students building in teams. And so they had to build these little houses to put wood for wood fuel into the houses. Most of the students had never lifted a hammer. So it was a good education, but it kind of gave them an idea of how you create a structure. So it kind of rooted their learning in something more practical, and they were learning in teams as well. Okay, so the course that we've developed, we have 3 partners. And I think it's very, it's an important part of the course that we have these partners. So one of our partners is the University of Plymouth. And we had to find a university that was sympathetic to developing a different kind of economics program. Because not all universities in England would be interested, but this university was very sympathetic. And actually, the university has worked with the college for 20 years on another program called Holistic Science. So we had this relationship already with the university. Our other 2 partners, one is the New Economics Foundation, And I'll say a bit more about New Economics Foundation in a bit. And then the Transition Network, which is the international network of transition town initiatives that's based in Totnes, but is now a global movement. So it's again very important to have these organizations, one of which is more rooted in the kind of concrete, practical, on-the-ground activity, and one of which is more theoretical, policy-orientated. So it's a very good balance for us. I thought I'd just explain briefly the structure of the program. I just put this in actually when Lorraine was talking about the structure of alternative economic programs. So we have three core modules. The first module, the ecological paradigm. So we start with ecology. We talk about Georgescu-Roegen and others. The second one is the emergence of the new economy. So this is more theoretical. And the third one, which is the module that I lead, is called New Economics in Practice. So I'll explain more about this. This is very based on project-based learning. And then we have a number of electives. Economics of Happiness. We ran this course with people from Bhutan, the country of Bhutan. And in Bhutan, they've replaced gross national product as the key indicator with gross national happiness. So they have indicators based on well-being. So we had people from the Center for Gross National Happiness come. We also had a Buddhist nun for the whole course because we didn't want it to be completely theoretical. Bhutan is a Buddhist country, and so we explored mindfulness and well-being from a Buddhist perspective to give a more practical understanding of the theoretical dimension. Another elective, Changing the Frame, all about communication, the importance of this notions of framing. I don't know if you have this in Spain, but this has become a big thing in America and the US, this notion that we can look at the way we use language to frame our arguments. Beyond development, similar in a sense to Economics of Happiness, challenging this ideologies of development. And then the fourth one, Enterprise Live. This is a program that I've been working on for the last 4 years, and I'll talk more about this later. And then finally, the students spend 4 months doing a dissertation, and I always encourage them to do an action research dissertation rather than a theoretical dissertation. So I'd say there are three kind of underlying orientations for the course. So the first one, an effectively based concern for social justice and ecological restoration. So affect is emotion. Okay, so again, in economics, we say everything should be objective, value-free, emotion-free. But we know this is nonsense, that people's choices and actions are based on their emotional response to certain things. And so we can't have an economics course that ignores emotion and affect. Secondly, research linked to action in the world. So we start with the real world, and then we look at it through the lens of different theories. We don't start with theory and then look at the world, because the danger, as we see with mainstream economics, is the theory starts to change the world. It starts to distort the world. So it's very dangerous to start with theory. I'll talk about more of this later. And then the third area, I think, is this thing about complexity. So an experiential understanding of complex responsive processes and how participation within these dynamics constructs meaning and patterns of activity. So, yeah, again, I'll talk more about this in my talk. But I'd say these are the kind of three underlying orientations. Okay, so that's a bit of background of the course, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about my own sort of journey in economics, because the way I teach economics is very much based on my experience studying and practicing economics. So my starting point actually for economics was I watched a documentary on the BBC in 1979 on the Mondragon cooperatives. So that's nearly 40 years ago. And I'd never heard of these kind of different economic approaches, so I was very struck by this program. And by chance, the next day, I had to write my entrance exam for university. It was the Oxford University entrance exam, and I wrote about the Mondragon cooperatives. And when I had my interview, they asked me about these cooperatives, and so that was my kind of entry into studying economics and politics at Oxford, was through the cooperatives in Mondragon. Anyway, so I enrolled in this course. The course was economics, but also politics and philosophy, so it's PPE. But there was a complete separation between the economics, the politics, and the philosophy. So in the economics program, I was just taught mainstream neoclassical economics. And I just ended up arguing all the time with my tutors, because it felt that they were telling me complete nonsense about Pareto optimality and efficiency and ridiculous. So they thought I was mad, I thought they were mad, and it just kind of wasn't good. But luckily, in I think it was my second year or third year, I came across this conference called the Other Economic Summit. So in 1984, there was the G7 summit in London, and a group of alternative economists organized an alternative summit. And it was, I think, the first sort of gathering, a kind of global gathering of alternative economists. And out of this, there was a book called The Living Economy, an edited book. And it's very interesting. When you look at that book, and then you look at the kind of critiques that are emerging now from students, actually a lot of the themes that were explored in the Other Economic Summit in 1984, they're still valid. You know, what kind of indicators should we be using? Well, et cetera, et cetera. It's very interesting. And I just wanted to read, this is from the introduction, and it could have been written today. It's in a way, it's a bit depressing. So he said, economics is at an impasse. Its instruments are blunted. Its direction is confused. The broad post-war consensus has evaporated. The experts resort to increasingly desperate remedies, and public opinion is both skeptical and bewildered. The very assumptions which form the basis of conventional economics are now unsound. Having ceased to describe the real world in its theories, economics has become incapable of acting coherently on the real world in practice. And it's really interesting, if you read some of the things that were said after the crash of 2007, exactly the same. So unfortunately, we're still stuck though with this economics. Okay. Anyway, so I left university. I spent 2 years sort of in the real world. I lived in Japan and the Philippines, and then after that I worked for 5 years for the New Economics Foundation, which is, as I say, a partner in our master's program. And it was a very interesting time, but it was very much, I felt it was very focused on theory and policy. So I learnt a lot about alternative economic theories and how those could be translated into policy. But in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, the UK government certainly wasn't listening. It was the Thatcher government and then the Major government. There was no interest. But I was lucky because one of the key influences on the New Economics Foundation is this book, Small is Beautiful. And Schumacher died in 1975, but one of his colleagues, George McRoby, who worked with him while he was alive, he was one of our trustees at the New Economics Foundation, and I worked with him for the last 2 or 3 years. And George had written a book called Small is Possible, which is was the follow-up to Small is Beautiful. And I became very interested in how can we translate these new economic ideas into practical work on the ground. And so after working with him for 3 years, then I got a job in Bristol, which is a big city in southwest England, and I became the manager of the Social Enterprise Development Agency. We worked very closely with the City Council. This was sort of 1993. I worked there for about 3 years. Yeah, it was a very good experience. Anyway, just going back to New Economics Foundation, one of the key influences that I was able to kind of draw on, and I also met this person called Manfred Max Neef, who's a Chilean economist, and I'd very much recommend these publications. I think we'll send the slides round, so if there's references, and I actually I did sort of write a talk. I'm probably not following my talk, but I'll send this round as well. So there is more references in this. But Manfred Max Neef is very interesting, I think, because he says that in all cultures there are these fundamental human needs. And he described 9, and then he said that these needs are satisfied in different ways in different cultures. So if you take subsistence, for example, with subsistence we have to eat, but eating can also meet our needs for affection or participation or leisure. But in different cultures we meet that need in different ways. So in Spain you have a culture around food. In England, we have a culture around food. They're very different. But underlying those, there are these needs around leisure, creation, etc., etc. So I found this a very powerful and quite a useful guide, because I was thinking, okay, I'm an economist, but I want to do something practical. I want to change the world. I want to, try and make the world a better place. So I focused down on subsistence, and with subsistence you can think about food, energy and housing. These are core things that we all need. And so we have crises in England around food poverty. We have crises around housing, particularly for young people. We have crises around energy, particularly energy poverty. And so it felt to me there were practical things that I could do, drawing on my economic experience, but also to do something practical on the ground. Okay, so the other element that I think has been very important to me is this notion of emotion. So when I was taught economics, I was taught that we must forget emotion. This is an objective, positive, value-free subject. When I was at university, we had this guest lectures from Amartya Sen, the great Indian economist. And he's written this very interesting book called The Idea of Justice. And one of the things he says in that book is that justice is not purely a kind of rational construct. We have this tradition in the West that we can build ideas of justice from, reason. But he said it's not just that. There is also an emotional component to notions of justice or injustice. And there is this nice quote, and you can kind of remember yourself as a child, these situations of injustice. And one of the people we work with. Sadly, he died last year, but he was an emeritus professor at the University of New Hampshire, a psychologist and professor of communication. And he says this, which I think is really important, and it's something that we again have as very kind of foundational to the work that we do with students. So he says, we begin our inquiries not by asking what a perfectly just society would look like, but from our felt sensing of a something being unjust, from our disquiets, from our feelings of things being not quite right. What moves us, reasonably enough, is not the realization that the world falls short of being completely just, which few of us expect, but that there are clearly remediable injustices around us which we want to eliminate. So, for us, we're running a master's program, but we feel it's perfectly appropriate to say to the students, what are these feelings of injustice that you have? What is it that concerns you? What are your starting points about ecological crisis or social injustice? For you, what are these starting points from which you want to begin your studies of economics? So for some of them, it might be, this crisis that we have in the environment. For some of us, it might be crises, the injustice that we see in the economy. I mean, this graph is a wonderful graph because you can see the beginning of the kind of dominance of neoliberal, neoclassical ideology in politics, but also in economic departments. And it all starts around the 1970s. And you can see how this has translated into us reaching again, which I think is a real achievement, the same levels of inequality that we had in the 1920s. So this is the great progress that neoclassical economics is talking about. Anyway, and there's a similar graph, the genuine progress indicator that says that GMP might be rising, but if you have a bigger basket of indicators, actually progress has been falling. Anyway, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the practical work that I'm involved with, not at Schumacher, but in my other work. So I work for an organization called Wessex Community Assets, but I involve my students in this work. So we do project-based learning. At the moment, my students are doing dissertations. So I have 4 students that are working with me in the work that I'm doing. So we very much try to integrate this practical work with the work that I'm doing. So most of my work is around housing, food and energy. I'm not going to talk too much about the bits at the bottom, the workspace finance and the training and community development, but those underpin. If I had longer, I would talk about it, but I don't have long. Okay, so the first and main work that I do at the moment, and also I began a PhD in October of last year, and it's about innovation in affordable housing. And it's drawing on my sort of economic background, but actually I'm part of a department of design and architecture. So I have a lot more freedom than if I was just in the business school or the economic school, so it's good. Okay, so in England, as I think in Barcelona, we have this real crisis of affordability for young people in particular and families on low income. And so my organization, we work with communities who set up what are called community land trusts. And so these are commons-based organizations. They identify for their community that there is a problem of affordable housing, and then we work with them to help them to develop affordable housing. For the last 7-8 years, most of that has been in smaller towns, but now we're working in bigger cities, working quite closely with the city authorities, the municipal councils in those places. So this is an example, Cristo Community Land Trust. It's a passive house development because the community said, we want affordable houses with low rent, but it also has to be affordable to run. You know, the people, they haven't got much money for heating the housing, so we want them to be as efficient as possible so they don't have to pay money for housing. So these are the houses that were built, the passive houses. These are some examples of some of the first houses that the different communities live. So we work in a sense as providing technical support, but we don't go in as experts. We go in as partners, and the communities are very much in the lead in terms of finding the land, setting up the legal structure, getting planning permission, finding a partner for the construction and the finance. So we are there to support, but not to lead the projects. These are some of the projects that we're currently doing. So this sort of shows the spread of the projects that we're working on. We're working with about 40 communities at the moment. 14 of those have completed, but now they're going on to do new projects. So one of the other projects that we're involved in is to set up a network where people from different communities can share their knowledge and their learning together. These are some of the examples of on the right is the community groups, and on the left are some of our bigger partners that can help with construction and finance. And just, very briefly, from an economic point of view, what we, essentially it's the community group accesses the land and the natural resources, because in a market economy, land and housing have become a speculative asset. And so we're finding, I'm sure you're finding in Barcelona, the price of land and housing is rising faster than inflation. And so with a community land trust, you get the land either free or at a very low cost, and then you put it into a commons, and then it doesn't form part of the cost of the housing to the people. So the community land trust is particularly focused on this land element, and then they work with a partner, a housing association, that can bring in some expertise. But again, it's very much the community that's leading. Another project that I set up with colleagues is a community energy project, and we work mainly with schools. We raised money from local people. We developed a new financial mechanism. So rather than going to banks or, private equity, this is a form of cooperative finance. We developed this, we raised £500,000 from local people, and then we put PV panels onto schools so that the schools can get free electricity. Arts centres as well. So we have about 16 projects across Dorset, and the schools and the community buildings, they'll save about £600,000 in energy costs over the next 20 years. So that's that project. And then another project, I was involved in this project for a long time. I have a particular interest in local food, and so for about 12 years I worked on a lot of local food initiatives and projects. So we set up a maker space for food. It was nearly 20 years ago, and out of this project we were able to do training for young people. We set up a school meals social enterprise working with about 35 schools. We set up a new kitchen for this. Lots of local sourcing to support the local economy. And the children all seem very happy. The one in the middle is my youngest daughter. She's now a bit older, but she hates me using this photograph, but I think it's a nice photograph. Okay. So those are the kind of projects that we try to link students with, because we feel that learning about the economy, as opposed to studying theoretical economics, you have to start with the real world. So we do a lot of project-based learning and action research. We say that it's really important, if you're going to do that work, to be able to access empirical data, of course, to access historical knowledge, to access case studies from around the world, to access literature, and also to draw on different theories from other disciplines as well. So you have this transdisciplinary approach. But very deliberately, the beginning point is project-based learning, action research. It's a real, focused on the real world. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to...
Yeah. You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes,
yeah.
Okay, fine. So to finish, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the kind of more theoretical underpinnings of our work, because I think these theoretical underpinnings challenge mainstream neoclassical approaches. So I'm trying to show how we can link this very practical project-based work with an understanding of theory to support that and to, and also, by the way, I mean, we don't spend a lot of time criticizing neoclassical economics. It's feels like a waste of time. But, we are able to show how these theoretical approaches are in very strong contrast to the theoretical underpinnings of mainstream neoclassical economics. So two of these theoretical underpinnings that I wanted to just talk about briefly. One is systems theory and complexity theory, and the other one is an economist, no, not an economist, an anthropologist called Karl Polanyi, that some of you may know. He wrote a book called The Great Transformation. So I'm going to try and just briefly talk about the way we bring these two approaches in, and then link that to the practical work that we do. Okay, so systems theory. So a lot of economics, including neoclassical economics, is based on systems thinking. It's a very powerful theoretical way of looking at the world, and it's very useful. So if you're running a business, it's very useful to be able to think in systems terms. So, but it has limitations. So we introduce it, but we also try to get the students to understand the limitations of systems thinking as well. Okay, so a simple system is like a clock. Okay, so a clock is a simple system, and it's very predictable. And if you look at the kind of underpinnings of neoclassical economics, it was rooted in people like Walras and others working at the end of the 19th century, who looked at classical physics, which is based on simple systems thinking, and they modeled economics on this, notion of the economy as a simple system, like a clock. And if you can work out what are the laws governing that simple system, then the economy can be much more predictable. You can come up with policy prescriptions, and we're still stuck. Neoclassical economics is still stuck in this 19th century way of understanding the economy as a simple, mechanical, predictable system. But it's clearly not. Somebody sent me a card. This is an illustration of systems thinking. So you put your socks as an input into the washing machine, and so the arrow is the washing machine. Then in the washing machine you get this transformation process, and then you get an output at the end. So this computer is a system, it's a system basically. So this is the output, but in a washing machine, sometimes the output is not always predictable. Anyway, I like that one. So there's a systems thinker called Donella Meadows. So she worked on the original Limits to Growth work. And she said that when you think about a system, systems have these different levels. And this is a very useful way of thinking about the economy as a whole or organizations, because we tend to think more towards the left-hand side. But actually she said that if you can think about things like the paradigm, the goals of the system, the rules, then it's much more powerful to work at that end of the system. So if you're thinking about the goals and the rules that govern companies, or you think about the kind of the paradigm that the economy is operating in, that's much more powerful than going sort of back down in the system. So it's very useful to think in that way. And for the work that I did in the local food sector, I used this systems thinking. So thinking about the inputs as these 5 capitals. Again, it's very useful to think about the kind of work that you need to do to fill gaps, etc. So I actually developed this when we had a number of food crises in England, and the demand for organic food increased tremendously, but nobody was producing organic food in England, or not enough, so it was all then imported. So there was a lot of demand on the right-hand side, but we didn't have the supply of organic food. But to get more supply, you had to break it down into the different factors that would then help to increase the supply. So this kind of systems thinking is useful, thinking about the economy, but again, it's limited, and we want to explore the limitations. This is another example. Anyway, I won't concentrate on that. When you, if you study at business school, at the moment everybody uses the business canvas, and the business canvas is a very simple systems model. So you have inputs, you have operations, you have outputs, you have customers. So this kind of systems thinking pervades economics, it pervades business schools. The problem with something like this is that actually within the business canvas, these 3 things in the middle are left out. We don't think about the core purpose of an organization. We don't think about the legal structure. We don't think about the stakeholders. So in economics and in business schools, there is this assumption that there are these entrepreneurs, there are these investors, everybody is kind of working towards an initial public offering where they can sell up, because something like the business canvas masks these other issues and questions. Anyway, so just thinking about economics. So economics is all based on these very simple, simplistic system, kind of views of the economy. So you have this circular, they call it the circular flow, the households and the firms. You have these supply and demand. You have this notion that the economy is an equilibrium system, that as an equilibrium system, it will always come back to equilibrium. And anyway, there's, I think Lauren mentioned this morning, the chief economist of the Bank of England. And he wrote a very interesting paper. And he said that economists think of the economy as like a rocking horse. And basically, the rocking horse, there might be a problem, something like the crash, and it's like the rocking horse is hit by a stick. And the rocking horse will rock like this, but eventually it will come back to equilibrium, because this is what our economic theories tell us. But he said, actually, in this paper, Who Scared the Rocking Horse? He said, actually, the economy is more like a herd of wild horses. And if you hit a wild horse with a stick, you have no idea where those horses are going to end up. And this is the same with the economy. If you think of the economy as a complex system, the notion of equilibrium is nonsensical. And the economy it's not an equilibrium system. You know, we've modeled the economy as a simple equilibrium system based on 19th century understanding of classical physics. But now in the 20th century, we have complexity science. So why aren't we modeling the economy as a complex system? Anyway, so luckily this is the chief economist of the Bank of England who's starting to now say this. So it's really helpful to have someone like that. Anyway, here's some examples of, you know, it's sort of some of the reasons why the economy is not a complex, is not a simple equilibrium system. Anyway, I won't go on that because I'm kind of running out of time. But we know that these things, you know, that we are experiencing, they're not just simple shocks that the economy can recover from. They're things that are really changing the way that the economy works. You know, things like climate change, things like the financialization of the economy, the massive increase in financial transactions compared to real transactions in the economy, what Piketty says about the way in which people with wealth, their wealth is increasing, but incomes are flatlining or reducing. And then this whole thing about robotics and AI. You know, we're not dealing with a 19th century economy. We're dealing with a fast-changing, complex economy. So yeah, complexity. And then what we try to do is we then say, okay, if we're beginning to see the economy as a complex system, how does this start to translate into the way that we actually act in the economy to transform the economy? So I have a number of slides about complexity, but I want to just finish by talking about Karl Polanyi, because I think this is an important sort of finishing point. Anyway, complex economies. I think this is you know, it's very interesting, the work that people are doing from an empirical perspective to look at complexity in the economy and the network effects. This is transnational corporations and the connections. Somebody has done something similar with the connections between financial institutions as well. Anyway, so Karl Polanyi, he wrote this book in the 1950s, and basically he was an anthropologist, and he looked at the history of the economy over the previous few hundred years. And he said that there is this double movement in the economy. So on the one hand, there is a movement towards economic liberalism and the establishment of a supposedly self-regulating market. And what this entailed is the enclosure of key factors of production like land, like physical capital, like financial capital, and workers themselves as well become commodified. So you have this one movement of economic liberalism, and then you have this other movement of kind of social protection, people trying to resist this spread of the market into all of our lives. And yeah, this is I think a really important graph, this one of the increase. The red line is the income of the top 1%, and then wages flatlining. So this is the work that Piketty did. So the way that we kind of translate this from a sort of theoretical point of view is we say that this model of the circular economy at the top, it's a fiction, and it masks what's really happening in the economy. So what's really happening in the economy is that 99% of households, they get their income from selling their labor. So that's a traditional Marxist point of view. Polanyi wasn't a Marxist. He rejected Marxist analysis. But what he would agree with, which is that there is this 1% of household who have this big control over the factors of production. so land, physical capital, financial capital, and data. And they are receiving rent and dividends from ownership of these factors of production. So if you look at economics as a discipline, you have neoclassical economics, but before that you had classical economics. And the classical economists said that the big problem is rent. But in neoclassical economics, this problem is ignored. But by ignoring it, we're masking what's actually happening in the real economy. So we feel it's really important for our students to understand these dynamics, because these are dynamics that are happening over time. I'd love to have an animation of this. This might need to get a student to develop an animation of it, because what you're seeing is those boxes of land, physical capital, financial capital, and data, they're expanding over time. And the income to the 9% is flatlining. So this is a real crucial problem. So then we say, okay, how do you address this? What are the practical responses to it? So these are some examples. So with the 99% of the households, how can we encourage employee-owned firms or cooperatives where the households receive a bigger percentage of the profits from the companies, like Mondragon, for example? With land, how can we start to put land or property into the commons? Physical capital, how do we develop maker spaces? Financial capital, how do we develop different forms of social capital? With data, how can we have open source knowledge, digital fabrication supported by open data, etc. And then, okay, I won't do these, but so then we get the students to engage with practical, real-life projects to explore, how does the theory fit with what's going on? What are the challenges of trying to introduce some of these ideas into a real-world context? So in the last module that I ran, we worked with a very big organic company, Riverford Organics. They deliver 40,000 vegetable boxes a week around the country. So it's a very big company. And the owner is selling it to his employees at a discount, at a 75% discount. He's selling it. So my students were working with employees of Riverford Organics, but in particular they were saying, how do we develop a new culture within the organization? Because it's a big shift from a company run by a single person to a company run by 500 employees. Very interesting. And I get students to work with other projects as well. So I think my time is probably up. 5 minutes. Okay. So this is Riverford Organic. You might be interested to have a look. It's a very interesting company. It's supplied in turn by a cooperative of 17, I think, organic farms feeding in. It's a very interesting network of. So for my students, it's very interesting. I wonder what this one is. This is. I think I'll move on from that. Okay, so just to finish then. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to link a practical, real-world, project-based education to a set of theories. And obviously I don't have much time. Our course is for a year and we explore many theories. But I just wanted to talk about those two, the systems theory, complexity theory, and the work by Carl Polanyi, which has a lot around, rent and how do we deal with that. But when our students enter into these real-world situations, they find that their theories, even the theories that we give them, they're not enough. They don't seem to work very well. And it's because they're still stuck with these models and these representations. So the other thing is we're trying to understand what's the difference between a kind of a theoretical approach and a real-life approach. So I work with a colleague called Patricia Shaw. So I'll just read this out because I think this is quite important. She says, "We make representations of the relatively stable patterns emerging in our ceaseless activity so that we can look at them together and agree on changes we can identify and plan for. This is why organizations, institutions, and the civic realm are full of models, 2x2 matrices, and mappings of various kinds." So this would be systems thinking, the kind of business planning tools that we give people, even the work of Polanyi and the models that we've developed by that. But then she says, but representations can never capture real complexity, because that complexity is a flow in time, not a static image or model. The representations are always not just inadequate, but useful approximations. They can really mislead and falsify. Taking them literally easily leads to frustration. So, if we're going to ask economists to go out into the real world and make a difference to try and change the world, they have to develop the ability to work with others. And we, okay, you can see the slides. Economics teaching, is all around these idealized representations. So I'm just going to get on to this, which I think is interesting. There was a person called Barnett Pearce, and he made this distinction between systemic thinking and thinking about systems. So he said, the thinking involved in thinking systemically is not only or even primarily a cognitive process, but inevitably involves acting into situations. One can and usually does think about systems from outside the system. But when thinking systemically, on the other hand, the thinker is self-reflexively a part of the system and takes the perspective of a participant or component of the system. So then I mentioned this guy, John Schotter. He talks about the difference between withness thinking and aboutness thinking. So he says thinking systemically is withness thinking. This entails a relationship of dialogue with the world, while aboutness thinking is an after-the-fact, monologic approach that is death to the world. So in the context of economics education, this implies that thinking about the economy as a system is not enough. We also need to cultivate a responsive relationship with all that we encounter in our practical activities. So, okay. So just going back, just to finish then with what I started, if I could get it to start. So I began by showing this representation of the starlings. And then you have these beautiful patterns. So this is something very real life, okay? It has a certain quality. And then we have the model. And the model is very, it's beautiful. I love these models. But these models are not reality. And so I suppose the question that I'd have to finish, which is kind of like the question to you, is what's the difference between, what's the difference between this real world situation of the birds flying like this and this model? Is there a difference? What is that difference? And how do we help our students to have experiences where they start to understand the difference? So I'm not going to give my, I have a thinking about what's the difference between, but I'm interested to hear if anybody else has another view. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Molt bé, si us sembla, podem fer ara 5 minuts d'algun comentari, perquè després al final tindrem uns 30 minuts de taula rodona, però si algú vol fer un comentari ara o responent a la pregunta que ell ha fet, abans de passar al següent ponent. Sí, sisplau, per favor.
Did you say
Yeah. No, now we make 5
Hola.
minutes of the debate.
okay. Sorry, I must put this on.
Contestant a la pregunta, jo crec que la diferència és el que en anglès es coneix com the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, que no té traducció a la nostra llengua, crec, i és això, no? Quan et fies de l'abstracció per creure que estàs explicant el que et creus que estàs explicant, però no. I ja està.
Gràcies. Sí, aquí hi havia un parell més de comentaris.
¿Puedo hacer la pregunta en inglés?
Perdón?
¿Puedo hablar en inglés?
Sí, sí,
Yeah,
por
okay.
favor.
Thanks very much for your discussion. I thought it was really interesting. I think it's quite funny. I'm an architect, so for me it's very obvious what the difference between that simulation and the reality is. And I think one of the main factors is that you said that that simulation was based on only 2 parameters, whereas in reality there are infinite more parameters. And I really liked the projects and the way you work. I mean, I work at the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia, and we work in a very similar fashion. And I was wondering if in one of the projects that you showed with Wessex, the Cristo passive house, I think that's a really interesting project, and I think it's very important also to engage students in real life activities. But what I was wondering was whether you took the opportunity, because although the houses may be passive and that may seem very innovative, I did notice that, for example, there were very traditional elements. For example, each house had a car park. So does that mean that each house or each person that lives in the house has a car? And so how do we sort of engage with the opportunities of not changing only the way we live in that house, but looking at the much bigger parameters? So can we start talking about, you know, sharing vehicles and things like that, which I assume these people don't work exactly where they live. They do have to travel. So how do you engage the community in a broader sense with respect to just the actual, you know, like in my house I live in a good way, but as soon as I step out into the real world, I'm not really engaging with what I'm engaging with in my house. So how do you, I don't know, how do you not deal with that paradox? Or, you know, get over the paradox? I don't know how to say it.
Okay, so the problem with a talk like this is that you don't have enough time to finish. And I'm just gonna show you at the end, look. The project that 2 of my students are working on for their dissertation is a project that I'm involved with for my own research, for my PhD, which is exactly about this. How do we develop with communities different ways of both constructing housing, but also different ways of designing, living. So one of the projects that we're working on at the moment is a co-housing project. I don't know how co-housing translates in Spanish or Catalan, but
we know the
you know?
concept.
Okay, you know co-housing.
Actually, you say co-housing in Spanish.
Yeah.
Not
You say co-housing. Okay. And so, we're working with the Architecture Association. And the Architecture Association is the biggest architecture school in the UK, but they have a college. I think it's the biggest.
I don't know if I'd say it, but yes, it's
Maybe
one of the
maybe
biggest.
it's the bar. I don't know. Anyway, and they have a college just near where I live, where they are designing and building in timber, and they have a robotic arm and lots of other, you know, they're exploring digital design and fabrication. So if I had longer, and maybe afterwards I can show you the slides, but my students, this is very much what they are exploring is kind of, you know, different ways of developing particularly co-housing and self-built housing, using sort of innovative methods and maker spaces. And so this is the co-housing project that we're working with, and these are the sort of different elements that we are trying to draw together for that. And the project that we're trying to develop is co-housing projects have a common house, and we want to create a pop-up workspace to get the residents and the local community to work together to create the common house as the first project. So my students are working with me to develop this project.
Cool. Look
And I got to do the rest of my presentation. Sorry.
Tenim aquí un parell de preguntes més, i una i l'altra.
Thanks for your lecture. It was very interesting and inspiring also. Thanks for sharing your journey in academic and professional life. So firstly, answering the question, my impression is that that model doesn't represent a real life. I mean, the first one, the horse, the economic, it's a linear model, and life is not linear. It's like cycles. And so the birds movement, they would represent these interactions and, what is called in neoclassic, neoliberal mainstream economics, like externalities. At the end, they are completely ignored, and they're not externalities, they are part of the real world. So that's what I see as a big difference of that model and real life. And then I would ask you, how do you see, if we are more optimistic or pessimistic, when you consider, for example, that statement from the 80s, and we are in the same position again, but at the same time there are many movements, as the ones you explained, that could bring us some hope, considering also that some countries are emerging so fastly and the levels of consumption, and they want to consume now, Asia and other emerging countries. How do you think the message could be spread to change the situation somehow?
Well, I say to my students that, that I started 30 years ago, and I think it's going to take another 30 years. I think it's not a short-term project. I think this shift, because I think in England, certainly, the difference that I see now from when I studied in the early 1980s is that we have different theories to draw on. So we have complexity theory, behavioral economics, and also we're able to draw on many other disciplines to show that the theory that underpins neoclassical economics doesn't stand up. So this is good. I wasn't able to do that when I was a student, so I think this is a really important to have this. And I think also we have both the empirical evidence that the neoliberal project has failed, and we also have a lot of practical activity on the ground. I mean, I mentioned this book, Small is Possible, that my ex-colleague George McRoby wrote, but if you read this book, there's nothing in there really. It's quite thin, whereas now, the book would be really thick. It's really exciting what's happening. And so I think we can, we have the theory, the empirical evidence, and the practical stuff on the ground, but I still think it's going to take a lot longer to have this shift. And I do worry, we have some of our students from Brazil have set up a college in Brazil, Escola Schumacher Brazil, and so I visited recently, and there is this concern that, do countries like Brazil have to go through the same sort of problem, like being driven by this neoliberal model, and then hit all these problems and then find alternatives, or can they shorten that process? It's a difficult question, I think, but I think that at least they're not in the position, say, that I was 30 years ago, or my fellow students were. At least they can draw on. We have a much more open world, and there's a lot more sharing of knowledge and experience, because of the web. So hopefully this period will be shorter. But I always start my module by taking people to the place where I live, and so I can show the students the projects I'm involved in. And we start with this workspace that I had an office. It's an old building, and I had an office there 20 years ago, and then it's been empty for 20 years. And the community has been trying to save it, and we've just reopened it. We raised money and reopened it as a workspace and incubator, and it took 20 years. I kind of, that's the first thing I show the students, and I can see them kind of going, oh, 20 years. But I think we have to have this patience to say these things take a long time. We can't change the world tomorrow. We have to commit to it for 30 or 40 years.
One last comment, please.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I think it was very interesting how you focus not on the theoretical criticism of neoclassical economics, even if, of course, you have a theoretical strong background, but on developing practical projects based on other values. I think it's a very interesting approach. My question was again about housing. I would like to know a bit more about the projects you start to develop in big cities. And how you face the problem of rising rents that, of course, we experience here also. What would be your recommendation for cities like Barcelona?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge in cities is you don't have as much space to build new housing. So it's a big question about how you deal with the existing housing stock and how you can transfer that housing stock from the private market into some form of commons or social institutions. And there are some very good examples from America where, I mean, for example, Bernie Sanders, he was the mayor of Burlington. And when he was the mayor of Burlington, he was involved in the setting up of the Burlington Community Land Trust, which I think now has 2,000 houses. And what they did is they created a fund. So the city council used some of their funds, like pension funds and other funds, to create a housing fund. So the housing fund was not just to build new houses, but also to buy up existing housing. And then the funds could be matched against commercial funds as well, because, you know, in a city, you can be pretty sure, particularly in a place like Barcelona, that you have a guaranteed long-term rental income from housing. And so, the problem obviously is that over time, those private rents are increasing more than inflation. So even if you are buying houses at market price in a city, you can then keep those rents flat as opposed to rising, you know, like a speculative asset, because you know that you're going to have a certain income stream. You can keep the rents at a certain level like this. So I think we have to start intervening in this way. It can't be done purely, I mean, regulation is part of it, you know, rent caps and restrictions on Airbnb, but I think also we need to, build these community land trust type structures which are very ambitious in terms of the numbers of houses that they want to bring into this kind of social ownership. So we are working, there's a place called Bournemouth, it's quite a big city, and we're working with the city council. So we're starting, there is some government funding that they are drawing down to start buying existing housing. And then we will refurbish the housing. So we'll also link that to training programs for people who are unemployed or to refugees. And then we will do that. And the other big movement is around student housing cooperatives. So again, there's a real problem in our country of student housing becoming more and more expensive. So we are looking at how we can work with students to develop these housing cooperatives as well. So that again would be buying existing housing, so not just building new housing. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Thank you very much.